So I'm Mary Martin, and I'm going to speak about religion and the voices of children and young people, 1670 to 1900. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, all children and young people in England and Wales were expected to speak up, if not speak out, through the medium of religious practice and experience. Their engagement could encompass not only the binaries of resistance and conformity, but also more nuanced aspects of experience, such as the opportunity to be creative, to please adults, yet exercise autonomy. Yet within the history of childhood and youth, from the 1670s to the late 19th century, the voices of children in religious terms have rarely been discussed, and then usually as victims of indoctrination or when they were dying. Religious historian Alec Ryrie noted that children had been ignored in the history of Protestantism and argued in Early Modern Childhood, published in 2020, that, quote, more surprisingly, historians of childhood have also paid little attention to the subject, perhaps because the social history milieu out of which the modern history of childhood emerged had deeply secularizing tendencies, unquote. And here are the two recent books on the topic by early modernists. Key historians of the modern period, notably Hugh Cunningham, adopted a secularization narrative, arguing that religion became less important in the 18th century due to the influence of Locke, Rousseau, and the Romantic poets, but was followed by a backlash in the early 19th before settling into a longer-term pattern of secularization. Now, his arguments are obviously restricted to the Western European context and or the Anglo-American world, and amidst discussion of the place of minority religious groups, as well as non-Christian religions. Now, although absent from this grand narrative, recent case studies do focus more on minorities, a very small percentage of the population, than on Anglicanism. For example, on Quakers and radical Unitarians. Some exceptions include my own work on the religious experience of 18th and 19th century British children across denominations, and that of Hugh Morrison on Presbyterians in New Zealand. Previous works on Victorian Britain by, for example, Ginger Frost and Pamela Horn, highlighted gloom in association with religion, but collections of working class autobiographies by Burnett, Vincent, and Mayle have highlighted the, quote, love and comfort which their religion brought, unquote, if only to a minority. And the secularization narrative on which much of the history of childhood, as well as of modern history and modernity rests, seems outdated, given the vitality of London in the present. To take some example from the census, in London, there were more attendees and places of worship in proportion to the population in 2011 than in 1971. So a bit on sources and methodology. There's been much debate about whether it's possible to recover the voices of children. For example, Ludmila Jordanova argued this was not possible as the main sources were written by adults. Some historians of religion, such as Alec Ryrie, have usefully highlighted that autobiographers are reflecting on their former selves. Yet experience is not just produced by the testimonies of individuals, but by complex webs of interaction and belonging. Religion provides a way of contextualizing children's experiences within religious communities structure, thus allowing for the identification of instances where children might act autonomously, often described as agency. Child psychology provides a perspective beyond these debates. Even babies are independent beings with their own thoughts and feelings, and develop through social constructivism. That's through interaction with the world and other people, even though their sphere of action might be limited. And another important way of thinking about children's experiences is embodiment. In the 1850s, the physician Charles West instructed nurses that they could learn about their young patients through observing bodily signs. As historians, we can garner clues about children's responses to religious phenomena from the observations of adults. Now, Children speaking up for religious purposes might constitute the enacting of expected social norms as well as autonomy, and their utterances were recorded in a variety of ways. Doting adults frequently wish to record their children's or grandchildren's own words as exactly as possible, often for the benefit of absent parents or other relatives, as will be shown below. Children's own letters and diaries have been highly valued. Another curious source was baby books, in which parents sometimes adopted the voice of babies. Many best-selling published sources in this time period claim to highlight children's voices in deathbed narratives or are about dying children. And so my sources have been chosen from my UK case study of the London hinterland, mainly from social elites, but also from a much wider sample, including collections of working class or labouring class autobiographies, as well as local records, school logbooks, ecclesiastical records, and so on. And I'm going to take the longue durée of 1673 to 1900 as its focus, following the publication of James Janeway's A Token for Children in 1673. This slide briefly just outlines the plethora of breakaway religious groups which developed in the 17th century and which survived into the 18th. So without going through all of them, there are a very large number of different Protestant sects, as well as the Church of England. These sects constitute about 10% of the population in the 18th century. Methodists originated in 1738, but broke away from the Church of England until 1791. And to be a Roman Catholic was illegal from 1534, but legislation 1791, 1829 eventually removed their disabilities. Though even in 1850, when the hierarchy was reinstated, there were huge protests. So I'm going to look at children's voices in religion across the infant, child, and youthful life cycle, drawing on the following themes: spirituality and religious practice, and that includes hymns, catechisms, sermons, and church attendance. And I'm going to look at opportunities in which children apparently spoke out with their own voice, as well as the context in which they were required to speak up. So I'll start with spirituality and evidence of children's spirituality in group and individual settings. So Naomi Pullin has shown how in 1682, a year of great persecution of Quakers in Bristol, some early Quaker children continued to hold meetings when their parents were in prison. And these included 55 youths aged 10 to 12. And similar examples of children's activism have been noted in the early 18th century in Silesia and New England, and also in late 19th century Wales. Now, the process of religious conversion was one in which children were expected to demonstrate autonomy. Berner and Underwood have noted that, quote, when people insist on reporting the choices they made aged 9, 10, or 14 as their own, their interpretation should not be dismissed, unquote. And although conversion narratives have been described as the first genre that gave the working class a voice and were often written retrospectively, in many religious denominations, such as the Baptists, young people had to give oral testimony before they could be admitted to full church membership, and these were often written down. Thus, the account of private personal experience was translated into public documents. Indeed, as Linda Wilson has shown, the narratives of many from the labouring poor and middling sort were published in denominational magazines. And they can also be found in collections like Zachariah Taft's biographical sketches or Thomas Jackson's Lives of the Early Methodist Preachers. Some conversion narratives were published as full-length individual life stories. And the manuscript memoir, which was written in old age, of Mary Bosanquet, born in 1739 from a high church, formerly Huguenot family, who became one of the early Methodist preachers, captured the pain of the conflict with her parents when she did speak up. Converted at the age of 8 by a Methodist serving girl, she gradually rejected her parents' lifestyle, deciding to speak out and oppose visits to the playhouse when she was 16. Quote, We conversed on the subject with great freedom, unquote. Her father listened carefully, but was not convinced. Quote, child, your arguments prove too much and therefore are not conclusive, unquote. And this world rejection was also practiced by many labouring women within Methodism and primitive Methodism. The wearing of plain dress, even for poor women rejecting ribbons, was a powerful embodiment of religious conviction. Another example from the elites is that of Elizabeth Fry, and her adoption of Quaker dress had an impact on her sisters. Much didactic literature, for example, in Sunday school magazines, told stories of children speaking up, converting their own parents, or reproving them for misuse of religious books. And another form of speaking out was even very young children's spontaneous utterances about religion. Elizabeth Fox Howard, an Anglican of Quaker descent, born in the 1870s, noted how their mother kept, quote, a loving record of our little sayings, unquote. Her little brother said very earnestly once, Mamma, may I taste some murdering insects, i.e. myrrh and incense, like baby Jesus? And he also said, for example, now tell me this one wrong, about his favourite stories. Older children might keep reflective accounts in their journals, as Katie Woodhouse has shown for the Quaker Betty Fothergill in the mid-18th century. The Anglican Ellen Buxton of Quaker ancestry wrote on Easter Sunday, April 20th, 1862, before her confirmation, when Lisa and I are going to be confirmed on the 14th of May next, and I hope God will indeed prepare me for it by his Holy Spirit. This is the happiest day to me in all the year. I think the thought of Christ's resurrection is quite delightful, unquote. So moving on to everyday religious practice. This is a way of communicating structural props for the faith. So it could be a site for measuring conformity, but it also provided opportunities for self-expression. And so in this section, I'll look up the expectations of speaking up and also the ways of speaking out which reflected originality. So learning hymns was an activity associated with the very youngest children, within which they might exercise creativity, and relations might record these instances for the benefit of friends and other relatives. Thus, about 1751, the Reverend John Barker, a retired dissenting minister, wrote to his friend, the minister Philip Doddridge, quote, our little girl I may not improperly call the music of our family, as she sung me this morning a hymn of Dr. Watt set to a tune of her own making, and when she has done, said, oh, grandpapa, heaven is a fine place, unquote. And there are other examples from this period. Mary Ann Schimmelpenninck described how Carrie, a very young child riding on the back of a mule on the way to the beach, said, quote, do let me say my hymn louder, for the poor mule is listening and cannot hear me, unquote. And very young children might instruct adults to write things down for them. In 1852, Sarah Angelina Ackland, who was born in 1849, doctor and Oxford professor, dictated a letter to her father to write down to send to her mother. And in it she said, I said my little hymn and I said one to Brooks, and I always do if I can. And Buxton's younger sister and brother's antics at family prayer illustrate how children might exercise autonomy and be accommodated within family religious rituals. In 1862, she recorded, Barclay and Janet come down to reading every morning, and I'm sorry to say do not always behave very well. During the hymn, sometimes Janet, who's 3, sings most tremendously loud, and when we stop in between the verses, she goes on as if there were no verses. Barclay does not sing so loud, but he fidgets more. The other day he fidgeted so much he nearly fell off his chair. So again, here's a way in which embodiment provides a means of interpreting the thoughts of very young children. And even the very young might also recite hymns and psalms on their deathbeds voluntarily. Betsy, the daughter of the dissenting minister Philip Doddridge, died before she was 5. And in their in their correspondence, it says the maid and Mrs. Doddridge had heard Betsy repeating parts of her father's prayers and preaching in 1736. And, quote, she solemnly recommended herself to God in the words that I had taught her a little before she died, unquote. And many other 19th century accounts of dying children describe children reciting hymns, not necessarily for publication, but simply written down by families. Children singing in public was another means of making their voices heard, even if it was not voluntary. This was a form of fundraising for charity schools from the early 18th century onwards, as at Christmas at Bath in 1711. At Box in Wiltshire, after the vicar taught the charity children 4 tunes, parents followed their example. The quality of singing in church improved and the congregation grew. And in the 19th century, children's singing could also give pleasure to adults. But the young could also be disturbingly independent. In 1764, the vicar of Thornhill near Wakefield complained that young people liked assembling to sing, but did not only stick to psalms as agreed, but wanted to sing anthems, normally only sung in cathedrals or places of similar status. However, the quality of their singing could be a cause for concern, with complaints about screaming and arrangements for instruction to remedy this. Although there's little evidence of the response of children of the labouring poor beyond some autobiographies of those who became well known, like Tom Mann, the Dockers leader, the resistance of one pupil at a national school in the 1860s is worthy of record. Quote, John Hurry, a troublesome boy who is master at home, refused to attend Leighton National School on Thursday afternoons because he disliked going to church to sing. So I'm now going to go on to catechisms. From 1559, all children were instructed to go to church to learn the church catechism, which they were then expected to perform publicly. Another form of speaking up. And although by the 18th century this occurred mainly in Lent, this was nevertheless expected of children of families of the labouring poor, some of whom were taught it at home. Dissenters from the Church of England often learned a different catechism at home, that of the Westminster Assembly, and they were expected to say this in church within dissenting communities. So much of the historiography around the catechism has emphasised it was meaningless rote learning, but the process could engage the young. And this is where this idea of social constructivism comes in. Mary Bosanquet recalled being taught the church catechism by her father on Sunday evenings from the age of 4 or 5. Quote, at these seasons, I remember asking many questions. And then she goes on to recall asking questions about the nature of God. And this isn't unusual. Children were supposed to be examined on the catechism in church on Sundays, as well as learning it at home. A rare example shows how speaking up could be intimidating. So in the 1840s, the vicar of St. Olave's Jewry used to catechize in church on Sunday afternoons. When Harriet Moore, daughter of a businessman, was, quote, 6 or 7 years old, quote, it was considered that I was old enough to go where the children stood at the altar rails. And instead of answering the questions, I burst into tears. I never went to catechizing again. A more confident response was in the late 1860s when the younger Acklands, choristers at Christ Church in Oxford, were catechized. One June, when one was asked during the catechizing session, quote, if you met John the Baptist in the street, would you recognize him? The answer was, I would cut him. Now, although in many instances catechizing shifted from church to school in the mid to late 19th century, it remained in some high church contexts. Agnes Cotton, who was a young woman growing up in Essex in the London hinterland in the 1840s, reported, we had a sermon for our Sunday school. In the evening, the children said their catechism and answered questions about the prophecies concerning Christ. They do not speak from the gallery as formally, but stand on or near the altar steps. So here catechizing had been adapted to coincide with the Sunday school anniversary, and the children now stood in a more central place in church than formerly. By the end of the century, some families were reacting against the practices of their youth. One example was Edward Ranulph Kenyon, who was a very serious evangelical born in the 1850s, son of a Queen's Counsel, and who became a general. But he said there had been too much of that kind of thing in his youth. However, his mother was determined that the children should learn their catechism, and when she came to stay, seized the opportunity. Peggy, the youngest, recalled that her grandmother asked her to say the creed after dinner. She knew that she should face east to do this, but couldn't remember where the east was. And so just remembered turning round helplessly, not being able to say anything. Sermons, one of the key features of the Reformed religions, were the practice most frequently associated with play. And children and young people voluntarily spoke out to others. The father of William Godwin gave sermons at home, and the young William, in turn, preached to his mother in the kitchen, aged 8. William Carey, a future founder of the Baptist Missionary Society, stood high up in a tree to preach to dull rustics. And girls played similar games. Mary Clark, born in 1825, daughter of a congregational shopkeeper, was allowed to play church, herself being the preacher, when she would repeat as much as she could of the sermon she had recently heard. She also invented her own funeral sermon. Yet it was not all play, and many children were expected to feed back about the sermon at home and in places of worship. At the public examination of Mary Mercy Ellis's Sunday School in 1806, this was congregational Sunday school, quote, so exact was her response given of the sermon, when asked unexpectedly, that she was given a handsomely bound Bible, unquote, by a member of the congregation, illustrating the impact on them. Another strategy within nonconformity and Methodism was young preachers, examples being William Jay, born in 1769, the former stonemason, who was known as the boy preacher, aged about 16, and the future evangelist Gypsy Smith, who was born in 1861. Started preaching with the Salvation Army when he was 17. So, and just to mention, writing was another way to speak out. Very young children were expected to copy out religious texts, and as they grew older, this could become a form of self-expression, which they chose to engage in, often decorating them themselves. Now, church attendance has been characterized as boring by, for example, Lynn Vallone. And this slide is another reminder of embodiment as a valuable means of understanding childhood. John Millet's My Second Sermon. Quaker meetings were mainly silent, and the diary entry of Louisa Gurney, cited by Catherine Gleadle, how I long to get a broom and bang the old Quakers, is often given an example of how boring church attendance or attendance at a place of worship could be for children. Church records give some indication of the behavior of children from different social classes. In the 1850s at Marsh Street Congregational Church, Walthamstow, the committee was resolved to put down matting to muffle the noise of the children kicking the treads. Another curious aspect of the sources are the voices of adults pretending to be children. About 1808, William Oswell, another businessman, wrote to his 3-year-old daughter, "Me goes to church and me tries to stay awake." And the same theme occurs in collections of baby books. In one from early 20th century America, a 3-week-old baby writes, allegedly, "I was very good today. I went to chapel for the first time and I did not cry." And but many children did record positive experiences of attending church and chapel across religious denominations. And children might speak up in church uninvited, yet their comments be welcomed. In 1788, Robert Raikes, founder of the Sunday School movement, described an incident in church. And this was when he described how about 80 ragamuffins, as he called them, or Sunday scholars filled the church at Colford, Gloucestershire. And one boy said, and pardon my accent, I wonder when the man will have done talking. So he obviously wanted the preacher to finish, and he said this out loudly in church. But Robert Raikes saw this as positive, commenting on how satisfying it would be if this boy grew up to be a worshipper, and reflected how little he and his correspondent, Edward Hawkins, were aware of the true worship of the deity at the same age. So to conclude, using a range of sources, this paper has illustrated some of the ways in which children spoke up and spoke out about religious matters during the period 1673 to 1900. Religious practice and utterance was an expected part of all children's upbringing and has often been interpreted by historians as oppressive. And the evidence about specific aspects of this experience, from spirituality to religious practice, shows how children might act autonomously in the context of these expectations, creatively devising their own words and music. Resistance could be expressed through embodied responses such as kicking, fidgeting, or choosing to wear plain dress. And the papers also suggested social constructivism and analysis of children's interactions as adults as an alternative to the current focus on structure and agency, as well as embodiment. And these themes, I would suggest, are very fruitful for future research. Thank you very much.